smiling as the entire room clapped for my grandfather's 80th birthday. To everyone else, it looked like the ultimate act of family devotion. But as I watched from the back of the room, my stomach twisted into a sickening knot. I knew the truth. This lavish, expensive party wasn't a celebration. It was an execution. Hidden beneath the birthday cake and the false laughter was a notary public waiting in the back room and a deed transfer document my parents were about to force a heavily medicated old man to sign. They thought they had covered every single base. They thought his historic $1 million property was finally theirs. But as my mother handed him the pen, the quiet, soft-spoken live-in nurse we had hired just 2 weeks ago suddenly stepped forward, slammed her hand on the table, and whispered, "If he signs that paper, I call the police." My name is Cressida, and at 34 years old, I never expected to find myself standing in the shadows of my own grandfather's house, acting like a spy against my own flesh and blood. But greed has a funny way of turning a family into a pack of wolves. We were standing in the grand ballroom of Grandpa Arthur's historic estate, a breathtaking $1 million property that my parents, Richard and Eleanor, had spent the last decade eyeing like a prize to be won. For years, they couldn't be bothered to call him, let alone visit. They were too busy drowning in their own massive debts, desperately trying to maintain a high society lifestyle they could no longer afford with leased luxury cars and maxed out credit cards. But suddenly, out of nowhere, they volunteered to throw Grandpa a massive, no-expense-spared 80th birthday bash. They told everyone it was out of the goodness of their hearts. I knew better. The lavish decorations, the flowing champagne, and the fake, plastic smiles were just a smokescreen to blind the guests from the trap my parents were setting. Before I tell you how a quiet nurse blew this entire family secret wide open, taking from, I love seeing how far these stories travel. I watched my mother raise her glass, her eyes scanning the room with a cold, calculating look that made my blood run cold. The storm was coming, and the trap was officially set. To truly understand the depth of their cruelty, you have to look at what happened just 2 weeks before the party. Up until that point, Grandpa Arthur was as sharp as a tack, managing his own affairs and tending to his beloved garden. But almost overnight, a terrifying shift occurred. He suddenly became profoundly drowsy, confused, and frail, barely able to remember what day of the week it was. My parents immediately stepped in, insisting his mind was failing and that he could no longer be left alone. While they pushed to control his schedule, I managed to push for professional help, which is how we hired Nurse Elena. Elena was an incredibly quiet, observant woman who moved through the house like a ghost. She didn't say much to my parents, but she was fiercely professional, keeping her head down and focusing entirely on Grandpa's care. However, within 48 hours of her arrival, I noticed something strange. Elena wasn't just administering medication. She was constantly examining the prescription bottles under the light, smelling the contents, and meticulously taking notes in a small, black leather ledger that she kept tucked inside her uniform pocket. Whenever my mother entered the room, Elena would instantly snap the notebook shut and slip it away. My parents dismissed her as just a simple, low-wage caregiver who didn't understand high society. They had no idea that those quiet, watchful eyes were already cataloging every single piece of their betrayal. The uneasy feeling in my chest kept growing until, the night before the big party, I simply couldn't sleep. Driven by pure instinct, I decided to drive over to Grandpa's estate completely unannounced. When I pulled up the driveway, the sprawling house was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence. The porch light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the front door. I walked up quietly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and knocked. What happened next completely terrified me. Shocked to see me standing there out of nowhere in the pitch dark, Grandpa opened the door just a tiny crack. His face was entirely pale, his hands were trembling violently, and his eyes darted around the empty hallway behind him in absolute terror. He grabbed my arm with unexpected force, pulled me inside, and whispered in a frantic, raspy voice, "Get inside, quickly. Hide right now." I didn't even have time to ask questions before the sharp, familiar click of designer heels echoed loudly from the upper landing. I heard my mother walk in, her voice calling out for Grandpa from the top of the stairs. Panic seized me. Following Grandpa's desperate gesture, I slipped into the shadows of the adjacent, darkened study and pulled the heavy wood door nearly shut. Through the narrow crack, I watched my mother descend the stairs, followed closely by my father. They weren't comforting an old man. Their faces were cold and businesslike. Standing right outside my hiding spot, I overheard them aggressively rehearsing their final timeline. They were detailing exactly how they would guide Grandpa's hand to sign the deed transfer documents tomorrow evening, the exact moment his heavy night sedatives would completely cloud his judgment. I waited in the suffocating darkness of that study until the sound of my parents' footsteps finally faded down the hallway. Slipping out of the house unnoticed, my mind was racing and my hands were shaking violently against the steering wheel. The horror of what my own parents were planning to do to Grandpa was too much to carry alone. As soon as I parked a few blocks away, I called Nurse Elena, my voice cracking with emotion as I warned her about the sinister conversation I had just overseen. To my absolute shock, Elena didn't gasp. She didn't sound surprised at all. Instead, her voice remained steady, calm, and chillingly professional over the line. She told me she had already discovered the blueprint of their betrayal. Elena revealed that the daily medication Grandpa had been taking for the past 2 weeks wasn't what his primary doctor had prescribed. My parents had been secretly swapping out his standard vitamins with heavy, unprescribed sedatives. They were deliberately poisoning his daily routine to fake a rapid cognitive decline, all so they could declare him mentally unfit and force him into signing over his life's work. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together, and the sheer malice of it left me completely breathless. Elena told me she had a plan for the birthday party, but she firmly refused to tell me what it was over the phone. She just told me to breathe, go home, and act perfectly normal in front of my parents the next day. I had absolutely no idea that her hidden plan would completely destroy my family, or that the quiet nurse was about to flip the script entirely. The day of the 80th birthday arrived, and the estate was transformed into a masterclass of high society deception. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles, and the grand ballroom overflowed with affluent guests, all drinking expensive wine and praising my parents for putting together such a beautiful tribute for Grandpa Arthur. Richard and Eleanor moved through the crowd like royalty, soaking up the admiration while putting on a flawless performance of devoted children. They lovingly guided a visibly frail, dazed Grandpa to the head of the main table, adjusting his collar and smiling for the cameras. But beneath the surface, the trap was springing shut. As the afternoon blurred into evening, my mother clinked her champagne glass, signaling the guests to move out into the sprawling garden for the final toast and a live jazz performance. The massive room emptied out within minutes, leaving only a few key players behind. My heart pounded against my ribs as my father checked his watch and locked the heavy double doors leading to the garden. From the back hallway, a shady, stone-faced man slipped into the room. A notary public my parents had secretly paid off. Richard walked up to Grandpa, pulling a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase and setting it flat on the table. Eleanor pressed a heavy gold pen into Grandpa's trembling, unsteady fingers, her voice dripping with synthetic warmth as she whispered that it was just some standard insurance paperwork to keep his medical care safe. Grandpa stared down at the lines with clouded, confused eyes, completely unaware that he was about to sign away his entire life's legacy. I wanted to scream, to run forward and stop it, but then I saw Nurse Elena step out from the shadows. Just as the metal tip of Grandpa's pen brushed against the signature line, Nurse Elena stepped forward with absolute authority. With a swift, fluid motion, she slid her hand over the document and pulled it away before Grandpa could ink his name. My father's face instantly flushed with anger. He snapped at her, his voice a harsh, suppressed hiss as he commanded her to mind her business, step back, and let the family handle their private affairs. But Elena didn't blink. The quiet, passive caregiver they thought they could push around vanished entirely, replaced by someone with ice in her veins. "This is my business," Elena said, her voice echoing with absolute confidence. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out the small leather ledger along with a sealed laboratory envelope. She dropped them right on top of the manila folder. She revealed a bombshell that turned both of my parents completely pale. She wasn't just a random agency nurse. Elena was a specialized investigator working alongside an elder financial abuse task force, and she had been tipped off by Grandpa's primary physician weeks ago when my parents suddenly demanded a change in his regular prescriptions. She opened her ledger, reading out the exact chemical analysis of Grandpa's daily meals and the altered medication bottles she had confiscated. Furthermore, she pointed directly toward the vintage bookshelf in the corner of the room, revealing a tiny, pinhole lens. She had installed hidden nanny cams in the study and dining area, recording every single conversation where my parents openly plotted to manipulate a heavily sedated elderly man. "If you don't walk out of this house right now and forfeit all legal claims," Elena whispered coldly, "this entire file goes straight to the police." My parents completely fell apart. The arrogance drained from their faces as they grabbed their things and fled the estate in total disgrace, terrified of the prison time waiting for them. Fast forward 3 months, and justice has never tasted sweeter. Once off the heavy sedatives, Grandpa Arthur made a full, miraculous recovery, his sharp and witty mind returning completely. He decided to sell the massive, stressful estate on his own terms. With the millions he made, he bought himself a beautiful, peaceful cottage by the sea and set up a heavily protected trust fund for me to ensure my future is secure. As for my parents, Grandpa cut them out of his will entirely. They lost everything to their own greed. What would you have done if you caught your own family doing this? Let me know.